John, let's stop pretending. Does God exist is not a profound question. It's the oldest scientific mistake humanity refuses to grow out of. For thousands of years, people pointed at lightning, disease, the stars, and where there was ignorance, they inserted God. The God hypothesis, as I wrote in The God Delusion, is simply the laziest explanation ever invented. You call faith noble. I call it intellectual surrender. The moment a mind stops searching because a deity is a more comforting answer than the truth. You say the universe shows purpose, but in The Blind Watchmaker, I demonstrated exactly the opposite. The appearance of design is what mindless, purposeless evolution produces when given enough time and enough failure. There is no watchmaker, just blind, pitiless indifference. And yet you insist, as you always do, that fine-tuning and mathematics whisper the name of God. John, the universe isn't whispering anything. You're just frightened of silence. You accuse atheists of requiring more faith than believers. Nonsense. Atheism is simply the refusal to pretend certainty where there is none. If anything, Christians have turned ignorance into a virtue and called it humility before God. You defend miracles. But miracles are nothing more than violations of everything we know about reality. In Outgrowing God, I said it plainly. Extraordinary claims without extraordinary evidence belong in mythology, not physics. So let me begin with the blunt honesty your worldview tries so hard to avoid. If God exists, he hides like a fugitive. If he doesn't, reality looks exactly as it should. You want to prove God exists? Good. Start by explaining why the most powerful being imaginable communicates less clearly than a bad radio signal. Or better yet, why the universe, vast, cold, majestic, bears no trace of a personal creator, but every trace of blind natural processes that neither know nor care we exist. John, faith may comfort you, but comfort doesn't make anything true. Let's begin.
Richard, you call faith intellectual surrender, but you surrender the moment you assume science is the only doorway to truth. You insist that God is a lazy explanation, but your atheism, dressed as science, collapses the moment you ask the simplest question: why is there a universe at all? Physics describes how it works, not why it exists, not why mathematics governs it, not why consciousness can understand it. In God's Undertaker, I argued this plainly. Your worldview assumes a universe built on mindlessness, yet depends entirely on the reliability of the human mind. A product you claim came from mindless processes. Tell me, Richard, why trust a brain that evolved from blind, pitiless indifference to give you truth, rather than just survival? You mock miracles as violations of nature. Fine, but your entire worldview violates logic. You want rationality from irrationality, meaning from meaninglessness, order from chaos, and morality from molecules. In Can Science Explain Everything? I showed that science, by its very method, cannot answer the ultimate questions you pretend it solves. Science explains mechanisms, not the origin of laws, not the origin of reason, and certainly not the origin of the moral dimension you smuggle into your arguments while denying its foundation. You say God hides, but perhaps he doesn't hide. Perhaps you only look where your microscope tells you to look. You scan atoms and expect to find a person. You examine biological processes and expect to see purpose written in chemical ink. That is not science, Richard. That is category error. You challenge me to explain why God doesn't communicate clearly, yet you stand inside a universe governed by rational laws, fine-tuned constants, DNA coded like a language, mathematics that maps reality with unnatural precision, and you call all of it silence. The irony is painful. You accuse believers of fear, but I suspect the fear you condemn is actually yours. The fear that the universe is not indifferent, not accidental, not meaningless, but intentional. Because if God exists, then reality is not yours to define, and the final word is not science, but truth. Truth that may demand something from you. So let's continue this debate, Richard. But let's not pretend that atheism is the brave position here.
John, every time you talk about fine-tuning or moral values, you reveal the very problem you refuse to face. You keep mistaking human perception for cosmic truth. You say the universe is rational, mathematical, intentional. No, The human brain is rational and mathematical because it evolved to detect patterns whether or not those patterns exist. As I wrote in The God Delusion, our minds are pattern-seeking machines desperately stitching meaning onto randomness. You trust reason as if it came pre-packaged from heaven, but natural selection doesn't care about truth, only survival. If a false belief helps you stay alive, evolution keeps it. So your entire argument collapses. The reliability of the mind is not proof of God. It's an accident of biology. And your miracle defense? That's just another attempt to smuggle magic into physics. You want exceptions to reality because exceptions give you wiggle room to insert a deity into every gap you can't explain. This is exactly how mythology survives. Not through evidence, but through human discomfort with uncertainty. You speak poetically about DNA being a language, but language implies a mind. DNA is a chemical. Chemicals do not need authors, they only need chemistry. Natural selection is not blind luck. It's cumulative probability across unimaginable timescales. That's why I called it the blind watchmaker. No foresight, no purpose, no designer, yet entirely capable of sculpting everything you see. And your accusation that atheism fears intention? No. Atheism simply refuses to hallucinate intention where none is required. You say science cannot answer why the universe exists. Correct. But ignorance is not a license to declare, God must have done it. That is the oldest intellectual shortcut in human history. You cling to your God not because evidence leads you to him, but because the alternative, a universe without a caretaker, without a script, without a purpose, terrifies you. The truth is harsh, John, but liberating. The universe does not owe us meaning. It does not speak. It does not care. And inventing a celestial author does nothing but anesthetize the mind against reality. So let me ask you again, plainly, where is God? In mathematics? In consciousness? In biology? Or only in the places where your fear refuses to remain silent?
Richard, you keep repeating that human perception stitches meaning onto randomness, yet you build your entire worldview on the assumption that this stitched meaning is trustworthy. That is the contradiction you never confront. You claim reason is a survival trick, but if human rationality is nothing more than an evolutionary hallucination, then every scientific conclusion you draw collapses under its own weight. If the mind is built for survival, not truth, then science itself becomes a sophisticated illusion. As I argued in God's Undertaker, a worldview that denies a rational creator undermines the very rationality required to deny him. You dismiss fine-tuning as human projection. Yet the constants of physics do not depend on our feelings. They existed long before human beings appeared. Mathematics is not a psychological pattern. It is the framework of the universe itself. You reduce DNA to chemistry, but chemistry does not write code, does not self-correct, does not store information in a digital linguistic structure. Calling DNA just chemicals is like calling the Library of Congress just paper. You accuse me of inserting God into gaps, but you are doing something far worse. You insert chance into every gap and pretend it becomes an explanation. Chance is not a mechanism. Chance does not create laws. Chance does not generate meaning. Chance is simply the absence of explanation dressed in scientific vocabulary. You say miracles violate physics, but physics itself needs a foundation. As I wrote in Can Science Explain Everything?, laws require a lawgiver, not a magician in the sky, but a rational source behind rational order. Your worldview insists the universe is meaningless, yet you demand that your arguments carry meaning. You say morality is a byproduct of survival, yet you speak as if truth matters. You say consciousness is an accident, yet you trust it completely. Richard, that is not courage. That is philosophical inconsistency. And now let me turn your question back to you. Where is God? Perhaps in the very rationality you use to deny him. Perhaps in the laws you treat as eternal. Perhaps in the mathematics you treat as universal. Or perhaps, and this is the thought that truly unsettles you, God is not silent. You are simply listening only to the frequencies that suit your unbelief. So let us continue, Richard. But understand this. A universe without God may be permissible, but a universe with reason, morality, order, mathematics, and consciousness without God is not merely improbable, it is incoherent.
John, you keep dressing the universe in elegance and purpose, but you never address the darker truth. If God exists, He is responsible for every atrocity you claim He redeems. You speak of rational order, moral grounding, divine intention. Let's examine that intention, shall we? In the God delusion, I describe the God of Scripture as jealous, petty, vindictive, bloodthirsty, misogynistic, homophobic, genocidal. And I stand by every word. If this being exists, He has more in common with a Bronze Age warlord than with the mathematical elegance you romanticize. You want morality to come from Him? Really? Let me remind you, the drowning of humanity in a flood, the slaughter of firstborn children, the endorsement of slavery, the stoning of rebels, the eternal torture of those who simply do not believe. And you call evolutionary ethics the dangerous worldview? No, John. Your God invented the very morals you condemn in human tyrants. You accuse atheism of lacking foundation, but at least atheism does not pretend that mass suffering was part of a loving plan. You say DNA is a language, fine-tuning implies mind, logic points to creator. Yet you ignore the one argument you cannot escape. If God designed the universe, He also designed cancer, parasites, childhood disease, tsunamis, genetic defects, and the heat death of the cosmos. Design? What a convenient word for a mind that refuses to accept chaos. You see patterns because randomness frightens you. You invent purpose because purposelessness terrifies you. You cling to a cosmic father because facing an indifferent universe would break you. In Outgrowing God, I said it clearly. Religion survives by exploiting fear. Fear of death, fear of meaninglessness, fear of taking responsibility for the universe as it is. You talk about the moral dimension. But morality without evidence is just opinion, and morality backed by divine authority is just opinion with a sword. So let me be brutally honest, John. If your God exists, He has explaining to do. If He doesn't, the brutality of nature makes perfect sense and requires no apology. You ask where my morality comes from. I'll tell you, from empathy, cooperation, evolution, rational thought, not from a cosmic dictator threatening eternal punishment. And now here's my question to you. How can you worship a God whose silence allows genocide, disease, suffering, and despair, yet call me the one afraid of truth?
You speak of evil as if its very existence defeats God, but you never stop to ask the more dangerous question. What is evil in a universe without Him? You list floods, disease, death, disasters, and with theatrical certainty declare them evidence against God. But under your worldview, these things aren't evil at all. They are simply physics executing itself, biology unfolding blindly, and chemistry obeying probability. In the God delusion, you call morality a product of evolution, a survival instinct. Fine, but then you turn around and condemn biblical morality as immoral. Richard, that word means nothing in your system. You cannot use moral outrage when your worldview dissolves morality into biology. A universe without God does not give you the luxury of righteous anger. It gives you atoms in motion. You ask why a loving God allows suffering, but suffering is only a problem if love and goodness are real. Under atheism, suffering is expected, meaningless, a mechanical byproduct of indifferent forces. You mock design because the world contains cancer and parasites. Yet evolution, the God you champion, produces the same horrors with equal enthusiasm. If suffering disproves God, it disproves evolution first. In Against the Flow, I showed that morality cannot be reduced to survival strategy. If you remove God, you don't just remove heaven, you remove the difference between a murder and a malfunction, a genocide and a genetic competition, a tragedy and a statistical event. You accuse me of needing God for comfort, but perhaps you need atheism for convenience. A purposeless universe never asks anything of you, never judges you, never calls you to account. You say God must explain evil. Very well, but atheism cannot even define it. You say God designed suffering, but suffering comes from freedom, and freedom is the price of love. A universe programmed to avoid pain would also avoid meaning. The real question, Richard, is this. Why does suffering bother you at all if the universe is as indifferent as you claim? Your outrage exposes the truth you deny. You expect the world to be better than it is. Expectation implies purpose. Purpose implies intention. And intention implies mind. Which brings us here. The existence of evil is not evidence against God. It is evidence that the universe is built on moral structure you cannot explain without him. Let me ask you plainly, if there is no God, why does your heart protest against suffering with a passion your own worldview cannot justify?
John, you keep talking as if morality, meaning, and human value collapse without God. But the truth is far more unsettling. They collapse the moment you attach them to God. You ask me where evil comes from in atheism. Let me answer you directly. Evil comes from human choices, not from cosmic commands, not from a divine plan, not from a universe that allows it. Humans are responsible for human actions, not chemistry, not physics, and certainly not a supernatural overseer. You call this accountability? I call it freedom, John. Freedom without celestial surveillance. You say suffering implies moral structure. No. Suffering implies biology colliding with circumstance. Your attempt to turn pain into divine evidence is nothing but a poetic way of avoiding the void. In The God Delusion, I argued that meaning is not something discovered, it is something created, and that is precisely why it is precious. Meaning imposed from above is obedience. Meaning built from within is authorship. You claim atheism cannot define evil, but a world where good and evil depend on God's mood is morally schizophrenic. Genocide becomes acceptable if the divine commander signs the order. Slavery becomes moral if Scripture approves it. Is that your foundation? Your God doesn't solve the problem of evil. He intensifies it. Because if he exists, he designed the rules, the humans who break them, and the punishment they fall into. That is not morality. That is celestial authoritarianism. You accuse atheism of lacking purpose, but purpose dictated from the outside is not purpose, it is programming. If your life's meaning comes pre-packaged from the sky, then you're not living, you're complying. And now the core of the disagreement. You fear a universe without God because it makes humans entirely responsible. I welcome it because it makes humans entirely free. Free to think, free to question, free to build meaning instead of inheriting it, free to choose morality instead of obeying it. So let me ask you plainly, John, which is more dignified? A humanity that stands on its own legs, or a humanity forever kneeling because it fears the implications of standing alone?
You speak passionately about freedom and human choice, yet your worldview is the very one that abolishes both. If the universe is nothing but matter in motion, then every thought, every decision, every moral judgment is simply the product of neurons firing according to physical laws you didn't choose. Under atheism, there is no you making choices, only chemistry executing scripts. So your claim that evil comes from human decisions collapses the moment you deny the existence of a free will capable of making decisions. In God's Undertaker, I warned that a deterministic universe erases both responsibility and dignity. You can't blame atoms for genocide, Richard. You say meaning is created, not discovered. But meaning created by a creature trapped inside a meaningless universe is not meaning. It is self-deception dressed as courage. You call divine purpose programming, yet call evolutionary programming freedom. Do you not see the contradiction? If we are the result of blind processes that neither know nor care we exist, then the values, purposes, and moral frameworks you celebrate are nothing more than adaptive illusions written into your biology. You speak of moral progress, yet deny any transcendent moral standard. Progress implies a direction, and direction implies a goal. But evolution has no goal. So what exactly are we progressing toward? You accuse God of authoritarianism. Fine, let's examine your alternative. A universe where no one ultimately answers for anything. No justice, no accountability, no moral guarantees, only power, survival, and decay. That is not freedom, Richard. That is abandonment. In Can Science Explain Everything?, I argued that our hunger for truth, our ability to reason, our moral intuitions, and our longing for meaning are not evolutionary accidents, but signposts pointing beyond ourselves. Your worldview sees these signposts and insists they lead nowhere. But the very fact that you protest injustice shows you expect more from reality than indifferent atoms can offer. So let me ask you plainly, if our lives are cosmic accidents, why should anything we do matter? If meaning is self-created, why does anyone else's meaning count? If freedom is an illusion, who is making the choices you celebrate? Richard, the freedom you preach is not the freedom of a dignified human being, but the freedom of a ship with no compass, sailing on a sea with no destination. And the meaning you create is not meaning. It is rebellion against the silence you assume, and a longing for transcendence you refuse to name. Let's continue.
You keep circling around rationality, morality, freedom, design, anything to avoid the only question that matters. Where is your God? Not theoretically, not poetically, not philosophically, actually, empirically, verifiably. You accuse me of determinism, yet your entire worldview rests on a God who refuses to show himself, refuses to speak clearly, refuses to provide the slightest piece of testable evidence that he exists outside your imagination. John, if a scientist behaved like your God, hiding data, refusing replication, avoiding observation, we would call him a fraud. You say I fear meaninglessness. No, I fear delusion. And you fear reality. In Outgrowing God, I wrote that religion thrives because humans cannot bear a world without a parent in the sky, watching, guiding, approving, comforting. You accuse me of invention, but you invent purpose because the alternative, the void, terrifies you. You talk about free will, yet your God allegedly designed our minds, our impulses, our world, our temptations, our weaknesses, and then punishes us for using the very faculties he engineered. You talk about moral law, yet claim a lawgiver who writes rules, then breaks them with miracles whenever it suits his narrative. You talk about meaning, yet your meaning is outsourced, pre-written, pre-packaged, a cosmic instruction manual you didn't choose. You claim atheism is an escape from accountability, but your God guarantees that tyrants who repent get paradise, and decent non-believers get torture. That is not justice, John. That is corruption sanctified by theology. So let me be brutally honest. If a God exists, he is incompetent for hiding himself this completely. If he doesn't, the silence of the universe makes perfect sense. You call the silence subtlety. I call it absence. You call faith trust. I call it wish projection. You call the universe intentional. I call it what it demonstrably is. 13.8 billion years of physics indifferent to our existence. So here is my final question, before we collide in the last round. John, do you truly believe God exists, or do you simply need him to exist because you cannot face a universe that does not revolve around human significance?
Richard, you keep asking where God is. Perhaps the better question is why you expect him to behave like a lab specimen rather than a person. You demand replication, observation, testability, but God is not a chemical reaction waiting for your permission to exist. You search for him with the tools of physics, and then declare him absent because he does not sit under your microscope. That is not science, Richard. That is pride disguised as methodology. You say the universe is silent, but silence only proves that you are listening to frequencies that cannot carry a voice. You say meaning is invented, yet you speak as if truth matters. As if your arguments matter, as if you matter. But in your universe, none of these things carry any weight beyond temporary neurons flickering in a cosmic accident. You accuse me of believing because I need God, but perhaps, and I say this gently, you refuse to believe because you fear what belief would demand of you. If God exists, Richard, the universe is not indifferent. Your life is not accidental. Your morality is not self-created. Your choices are not illusions, and your conclusions are not the final word. You want God to reveal himself unmistakably, but unmistakable revelation would force belief and destroy freedom. A God who coerces belief does not create lovers, only prisoners. You say God is hiding, but maybe God is not hiding. Maybe he is simply refusing to shout over the noise you call certainty. So let me end with this, Richard. Not as a preacher, not as a philosopher, but as a man speaking to another man. If God does not exist, you lose nothing but illusion. If God does exist, you lose nothing less than the truth about yourself. The question has never been, where is God? The question has always been, are you willing to find him if he is not where you want him to be? And with that, I leave the silence to speak for itself.